talking about post-war and the Cold War, you have to understand that the Cold War was not an actual physical fight as far as what we have known wars to be in the past. It's going to be an idea struggle between communism versus capitalism. The United States as a democracy versus the society that is created by communism, and who's eventually going to win. So when we're talking about how do we get to that point of the Cold War, because Russia and the United States were allies during World War II. Well, at the Yalta and then later the Potsdam Conference, which basically accomplished the same things, they decide on how they're going to treat Germany after World War II. And they're going to split it into 4 different sections, including the city of Berlin into 4 different sections. And each part of the Allies is going to get a different section and is going to be in charge of running those sections. However, 3 out of the 4 are going to be capitalist and 1's going to be communist, which ends up creating 2 separate nations of West and East Germany. If you're noticing, Berlin is in East Germany, which is going to create a problem for the Allies living in the city of Berlin, when all of these supply lines are cut off in an attempt to make the entire city communist. And so what basically Khrushchev was the person who decided to do that. What the Allies decide to do is the Berlin Airlift. And the Berlin Airlift is basically when the Allies are airlifting supplies for about a year into Berlin through airplanes to be able to get the support that they need. And this is also when they build the Berlin Wall to separate the different sides of the communist versus the capitalist sections. During the post-war years, you're going to see the creation of the United Nations, which is sort of like the League of Nations, but actually successful. And the United Nations is going to play a huge part when we're talking about the Cold War and proxy wars, and continues to still play a major part as far as being able to open up a line of communication between different countries. The United Nations was the major force in proxy wars like the Korean War, where it's not technically United States troops who are fighting against communism in North Korea. It's going to be mainly United Nations troops made up mainly of Americans, technically. You're also going to see the creation of the Iron Curtain. So as Russia is invading into Eastern Europe, in an effort to get to Germany during World War II, they are taking over and they are creating these communist countries in the Slavic areas, which is basically Eastern Europe. And they create this idea of an Iron Curtain, or a buffer zone, so that way if anybody from Western Europe decides to attack them again, they have countries in between them and the attackers. So Europe is basically split in half. The right side, or the eastern side, is going to be belonging to the Russians and the communists that they're going to control through the Warsaw Pact. And then on the other side, it's going to be the capitalist countries that is controlled by the United States through NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the reason why these countries are so loyal to the United States is because of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is when the United States funded all development for Western Europe to rebuild after the war. They could have been completely destroyed, and honestly they should have been completely destroyed, sort of like after World War I, but they weren't because America was funneling so much money in, which ended up creating welfare systems, which still exist today as well. And so it's going to be NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, communism versus capitalism for the Cold War. In addition, there's going to be an increase in nationalism with as far as the decolonization movement. Gandhi is going to lead that nationalistic movement and create a free and independent India. There's also going to be the creation of Israel as an independent country for Jews, which originally was Palestine and owned by Great Britain. But the idea of Zionism had become apparent where they needed to create an independent Jewish nation, which is still heavily contested by a lot of Middle Eastern countries today. And also in the Vietnam War, when Ho Chi Minh wanted to create a free and united communist Vietnam, and eventually he won that goal after America lost the Vietnam War. In the 1960s, that's going to be the height of the Cold War era. There's going to be a massive increase in space technology with, the United States creation of NASA, And with the launch of Sputnik from the Russians, as far as and also putting the first man in space, they did not get the first man on the moon, but it's sort of hotly contested over who actually won the space race. The height of the time period is going to be with Kennedy, President John F. Kennedy, and Khrushchev, who is going to be the ruler after Stalin dies in 1953. Stalin is the one who really sets off the Cold War. He's going to be a brutal dictator. When Khrushchev gets into play in 1956, he is going to be in power for about 8 years until 1964. Khrushchev, or you might know him as Corn Man, he creates this policy of de-Stalinization, saying that he basically blamed all of his problems on Stalin. He said that Stalin created this cult of personality and that he was going to come in and try to de-escalate the war and try to lead the country. However, he was not all that successful at it. He was a man of a lot of conflicts, because on one side he wanted to de-escalate the war, but then on the other side he ranted to the United Nations about wanting to destroy the United States. So a little conflicting there. The height of that power is going to be during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the United States tried to sneak into Cuba to assassinate Fidel Castro and take away the communist leaders and communist leadership in Cuba, because we were nervous about them being so close to the coast of Florida, only 90 miles. And this rose a massive problem because they called on Russia to put nuclear bombs in Cuba after this incident, after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, which just happened. And so this created an international crisis that took us all the way to DEFCON 2, which was one step away from launching a nuclear weapon, which would have blown up and destroyed the entire world. Kennedy tried to fix the situation by creating a blockade from shipping from Russia to Cuba, and Russia couldn't really do anything because the United States had missiles as well in Turkey and in Greece. So we were one step away from blowing each other up until they managed to create a peace agreement where the United States would pull our missiles out of Greece and Turkey, and the Russians would pull their missiles out of Cuba, and that is how we managed to escape from near destruction in the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, this sealed the deal for Khrushchev. People did not like the fact that he was being easy on the Americans, and they eventually kicked him out. And the next person, Brezhnev, he is going to create this Brezhnev Doctrine, which is sort of like the Truman Doctrine is when the idea of containing communism, but honestly I see it more of like the Monroe Doctrine way back in American history. And in the Monroe Doctrine, we had the idea that, and the Roosevelt Corollary, both of them, we had the idea that America has dictatorship, almost, power over all of the Americas, North and South, and that if any European power tried to invade on our territory, we would react. And that's the idea of the Brezhnev Doctrine, that if there was any sort of a rebellion or any sort of a problem in a country that called on the communists, or in a communist country that was rebelling against the communists, they would have the right to intervene as the communist superpower in the world. And that's going to be pretty much the height of the Cold War and the end of those post-war conflicts.